The fog that clung to the outskirts of London in the autumn of 1940 was a living thing, a grey and shifting veil that swallowed sound and distorted distance, wrapping entire streets in a heavy stillness that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of distant artillery. Beneath it, trains moved like ghosts along the rails, ferrying evacuees towards scattered pockets of relative safety. Parents kissed their children goodbye on platforms illuminated only by dim wartime lamps, their silhouettes trembling as if already half disappearing into the uncertainty that had consumed Europe. It was during one of these mass relocations, during a week when the Luftwaffe's raids tore open the sky with such regular fury that the government ordered convoys of children out of London in hastier, less supervised waves, that a train filled with nearly 300 evacuees departed from Paddington Station and vanished without leaving a trace. The records said it had departed. Witnesses claimed to have seen it leaving the station, but somewhere between the heart of London and the rural rail junctions beyond Reading, the train simply ceased to exist, leaving authorities scrambling for explanations they could neither prove nor believe. For decades, the missing evacuees became a grim footnote in wartime history, overshadowed by the many tragedies that occupied the nation's collective memory. Families received no answers, only silence wrapped in official statements and polite refusals to elaborate. As the war intensified, the vanished train became yet another wound that Britain was too exhausted to examine closely. Some survivors of the era whispered that sabotage must have been involved, while others believed the train had been destroyed in a bombing raid so total that no fragments were ever identified. But the truth sank deeper, slipping into the earth itself, lying dormant for 85 years beneath a blanket of soil that masked not only the train's resting place, but the story of what had happened to the souls aboard. And when the year 2025 arrived, few still alive remembered the children's names or the frantic search that had once consumed entire villages, constables, railway workers, and desperate parents. The world had moved on. Technology had transformed everything, yet the earth had guarded its secret with a devotion that seemed almost deliberate. It was only by chance, or something else, something older, that the discovery was made. In January of 2025, during a dreary winter whose cold seemed determined to postpone any hint of spring, a farming couple in Berkshire began clearing an old barn that had belonged to the husband's grandfather. The structure was set apart from the main farmhouse, its boards warped, its foundation half sunken, its roofline tilted, as if bowing beneath invisible pressure. They had always assumed the land beneath it was ordinary soil, but as they began dismantling the rotten floorboards, the husband noticed that one plank had settled unnaturally low, creating a hollow resonance when stepped upon. He pried it up, expecting perhaps a forgotten drainage pit or collapsed support beam. Instead, he uncovered a tightly packed layer of compacted earth that seemed deliberately arranged, as though someone had sealed something beneath it. Curiosity became unease when they struck metal. At first it looked like rusted piping, but as they cleared more dirt away, the unmistakable curve of a carriage window frame emerged. Its glass shattered long ago, its edges fused with mud as if the landscape itself had grown around it. Before we go deeper into this descent through forgotten time, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? Your presence, your perspective, becomes a small but vital tether as we move forward through what was uncovered, and what should perhaps have remained sealed in the dark. The authorities were summoned. Excavation teams arrived, and slowly, impossibly, the shape revealed itself. A full railway carriage buried at a depth that made no logical sense. It had not crashed. It had not toppled. It had been placed, suffocated under the weight of decades, hidden with such precision that no natural disaster could account for it. The discovery drew the attention of historians, forensic analysts, and military archivists, each attempting to reconcile the impossible truth with the rigid logic of wartime records. How could a train, complete with its passengers, vanish without sound or witness, only to resurface beneath a barn constructed 3 years after its disappearance? The barn itself, according to old property records, had been erected on land that had shown no sign of disturbance. Yet the soil layers told a different story. Something enormous had been buried there mid-century, and someone had taken deliberate steps to conceal it. When the first carriage door was pried open, the stale air that escaped was thick with the scent of rot and rust, mingled with something colder and older, a scent that made the excavation crew stagger back with a chill they could not name. Flashlights illuminated rows of seats in perfect alignment, though each one was coated in a film of earth and time. Children's suitcases were still tucked beneath the benches. Wool scarves dangled from luggage hooks, preserved as though waiting for hands that would never return. And as the team pressed farther inside, noting with growing dread that every window had been sealed from the outside with slabs of soil, the weight of the truth settled into their bones. The passengers had never escaped. They had never reached their destination. They had suffocated in silence, interred alive in a mechanical tomb no one had known to search for underground. The deeper they ventured, the more chilling the evidence became. Personal items were strewn along the aisles, not in chaos, but in a strange, eerie pattern that suggested the occupants had not panicked, or perhaps had been incapable of doing so. Some believed they had been drugged. Others theorized that the lack of oxygen had claimed them before they realized they were trapped. But scattered among the relics were inexplicable details. A child's notebook, filled with frantic scribbles that seemed to shift in tone and subject, pages ending abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. A pocket watch, stopped at a time that did not match the presumed burial window. Shoe prints that overlapped in strange sequences, as though people had walked up and down the carriage long after they should have succumbed. The investigators grew increasingly uneasy, whispering about the sounds they thought they heard in the hollow space beneath the next carriage. Metallic groans, a soft tapping, and on the third night of excavation, a researcher swore she heard faint breathing echoing from somewhere deep within the sealed compartments. Rumors spread quickly, drawing media attention that authorities tried, unsuccessfully, to control. But the story had already ignited something dormant in the public imagination, a hunger for answers, a fascination with the uncanny and the unresolved. As forensic teams continued uncovering additional carriages, each one bearing signs that defied conventional explanation, the scope of the tragedy expanded far beyond the initial assumptions. This was not merely an accident. It was not an overlooked wartime disaster. It was something orchestrated, something carefully hidden, something that demanded a narrative far more unsettling than any official records suggested. And the more they revealed, the more the lines blurred between history and horror. If this descent into an 85-year-old nightmare is drawing you in, if the weight of the uncovered truth presses at the edges of your curiosity, then let yourself be pulled deeper into the darkness with us. And before we continue, allow the shadows to whisper a reminder. Subscribe to this channel so you don't lose your way as we follow the buried tracks of this vanishing. What comes next demands that you stay with us. The investigation that followed the unearthing of the train beneath the Berkshire barn became one of the most secretive and perplexing operations in modern British history. From the moment the second carriage was breached, the site was sealed off under the authority of the Ministry of Defence, and any mention of it was quickly stripped from online platforms and local news. Yet information has a way of leaking through the cracks, in whispers, in fragments, in photographs that appear for seconds before vanishing again. What little escaped painted a picture of something beyond the scope of any conventional disaster investigation. The imagery was grim, almost ceremonial in its arrangement. The bodies, or what remained of them, positioned in unnerving stillness, facing the same direction, their belongings placed neatly at their sides, as if laid out for inspection. But what unsettled the forensic analysts most was not what they found. It was what they didn't. There were no signs of decomposition typical for remains sealed underground for 85 years. The temperature and air conditions should have left only bone dust. Instead, traces of tissue persisted, as though preserved by a process that defied biology, the flesh mummified not by time, but by something that had arrested it midway through decay. The team that handled the first autopsies worked under military supervision. Their reports, marked as restricted, but leaked transcripts, later hinted at anomalies in cellular breakdown, mineral deposits in the blood, and evidence of what one anonymous pathologist described as radiological interference of unknown type. This phrase appeared repeatedly across several redacted documents that were never meant to see daylight. Radiation was not new to 1940, but the kind referenced here was unlike any known wartime weapon or accident. It suggested exposure to an energy source that didn't match any known profile, one that seemed to have fused organic matter with the very metal of the carriages. Samples of rusted rail and preserved tissue were found to share microscopic crystalline patterns, as if the human and the mechanical had merged at a molecular level. It was an impossible convergence, yet every test repeated the same result. Something had happened inside those carriages that went beyond suffocation, beyond sabotage. It was transformation. One of the first historians granted limited access to the findings, Dr. Evelyn Harrow, a specialist in wartime transport records, began digging into archival manifests, passenger lists, and railway communications from the week of the disappearance. Her research uncovered a chilling inconsistency. The official record listed the train as Evacuation Convoy 728, scheduled to depart from Paddington at 21:40 on October 18, 1940. Yet earlier drafts of the evacuation order made no mention of this convoy number at all. In fact, Convoy 728 appeared nowhere in the railway's sequence before or after that date. It was a phantom entry, a convoy number that seemed to have been inserted into the records retroactively. When she compared the manifests of children listed on that train with school rosters, she discovered another oddity. Several of the listed evacuees were duplicates of names already recorded on other trains bound for different destinations. The implication was horrifying, either an administrative error of impossible scale or deliberate manipulation meant to create the illusion of a legitimate transport. Harrow's notes revealed that among the passenger lists was a secondary column of initials that did not correspond to any known documentation format. It appeared to have been added hastily in pencil, each entry containing a small symbol beside it, a mark that resembled the looping curve of an infinity sign crossed with a vertical line. She sent copies of these symbols to a colleague in the Department of Anthropology at Oxford, who in turn connected them to an obscure pre-Christian sigil used by certain fringe sects that worshipped under the concept of the circle unbroken. a ritualistic emblem representing perpetual return through burial and rebirth. The presence of such a symbol in a wartime evacuation list made no sense, yet it was there, preserved in the ink and graphite of 1940, staring back through the decades like an accusation. Meanwhile, beneath the excavation site, progress slowed. The ground resisted every attempt to remove the remaining carriages. Machinery failed inexplicably. Floodlights flickered and died, though power readings showed no fault in the cables. Workers reported sudden drops in temperature, and one engineer described hearing what he called the sound of air, moving where there shouldn't be any space for it. Some of them refused to return after nightfall. One by one, the civilian contractors withdrew until only the military teams remained, their operations conducted under flood-lit tents and guarded perimeters. What little light shone on the site revealed faces strained with exhaustion and a kind of hollow dread. Even those who refused to believe in anything supernatural began to admit that something about the ground itself felt wrong, as though it pulsed with memory. Among the recovered artifacts was a pocket recorder, primitive by modern standards but experimental for its time, thought to belong to one of the train's supervisors. Miraculously, the device's internal mechanism had been shielded enough to preserve several minutes of audio. The restoration took weeks, and when the playback was finally possible, it delivered only confusion. The recording began with the sound of wind and rhythmic clatter, suggesting it had been made while the train was still in motion. Then a voice, distorted and faint, possibly that of the supervisor, spoke in clipped tones. Convoy on schedule. Passengers calm. Odd signal interference from west frequency. A pause, followed by faint static. Then the voice again, softer. No lights ahead. It's just gone. The signal box isn't responding. The next sound was not human. It was a long, resonant hum, low, mechanical, yet strangely melodic, followed by the scraping of metal and a burst of static so intense that the recorder's motor seized. There was no screaming, no chaos, just silence that lasted 21 seconds before the recording cut off entirely. Those who listened to it later described feeling as though something was still resonating in their ears long after it ended, a vibration that seemed to come from within the skull rather than from any external sound. As Harrow's investigation deepened, she began noticing a disturbing pattern of disappearances among those connected to the discovery. A journalist who had published an early article about the barn was reported missing 2 weeks later. A local constable who had spoken anonymously to a tabloid was found drowned in a reservoir with no signs of struggle. Even one of the forensic analysts, who had confided to a colleague that he was considering leaking photographs of the site, failed to show up for work and was never seen again. The official response to these vanishings was silence, the same silence that had followed the original event 85 years before. It was as if the earth had opened once more to reclaim those who disturbed it. By the time March 2025 arrived, the excavation was abruptly halted. Officially, the reason was unstable geological conditions. Unofficially, those still stationed at the site told a different story. On the final night of digging, sensors buried near the remaining carriages detected movement. Not shifts in soil or collapsing metal, but rhythmic vibrations consistent with something inside the buried compartments. The readings lasted precisely 7 minutes before stopping abruptly. When engineers attempted to recheck the signals, the equipment failed entirely, their screens showing only a line of static that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. After that, the site was filled, sealed, and fenced off with warning signs about contamination and subsidence. No further excavation was authorized, but legends grow where silence reigns. Locals began to claim that on certain nights when fog drifts across the valley, you can still hear the faint whistle of a train somewhere beneath the ground, echoing as if trapped between worlds, a sound that fades when approached, leaving behind only the smell of coal and damp metal. And though the official narrative insists the discovery was exaggerated, those who saw the carriages with their own eyes speak of faces visible through the glass for a moment, pale and watching before the soil consumed them again. If you felt that chill while listening, that moment where history begins to breathe again, remember to hold on to it, subscribe, and stay close as we follow Dr. Harrow deeper into her search and into the documents that were never meant to survive. Because what she finds next will unravel the boundary between time, death, and the impossible. When Dr. Evelyn Harrow was quietly dismissed from her consultancy role with the ministry, she understood that her access to the train's official files would vanish overnight. But she had already anticipated this moment. In the weeks preceding her removal, she had begun copying fragments of digital records onto an encrypted drive, not to expose them to the public yet, but to keep them from disappearing. She knew the patterns of bureaucratic erasure too well. Data would be reclassified, reports redacted, archives quietly wiped under the justification of national security. It had happened before, and it would happen again. Yet this time, she felt a pull stronger than academic curiosity. Something deeper, as though the buried train had reached out from the soil to drag her along its invisible tracks. She began receiving anonymous messages, short and fragmented, always from untraceable sources. The first one contained only coordinates, the second a single line. It wasn't an evacuation, it was an exchange. The implication haunted her. In April of 2025, she left London and drove west, following the coordinates into the fog-drenched countryside near the original excavation site. The road narrowed to a single lane, hemmed in by hedgerows that seemed to lean inward, their branches skeletal in the fading light. When she reached the spot marked on the map, she found not a hidden military base or forgotten rail line, but the remnants of an air raid shelter, concrete walls fractured with age, half buried under moss and bramble. Its entrance was blocked by debris, yet faint drafts of air moved through cracks in the structure, carrying the smell of wet stone and iron. She cleared enough rubble to squeeze inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom to reveal a tunnel that descended into blackness. The walls were etched with symbols, faint, repetitive, carved by hand, the same looping insignia that had appeared beside the names in the train's manifest. Only here, it was everywhere, layer upon layer of it, as if 1,000 hands had tried to mark the same shape again and again in the dark. At the tunnel's end, she discovered a rusted hatch door bearing the faded logo of the Great Western Railway. Her pulse quickened. It was absurd. There was no record of any tunnel connecting to the Berkshire line from this area, and yet here it was, sealed tight with decades of corrosion. When she forced it open, the sound it made echoed like a scream through the concrete passage. Behind it lay a chamber filled with crates, their contents half-rotted but still identifiable. Old uniforms, ration tins, medical kits, and beneath them a stack of documents bound with twine and marked property of the War Office, 1940. Her hands trembled as she opened the first bundle. Inside were correspondence letters between a railway administrator and a figure identified only by initials, MR. The letters spoke in careful euphemisms, but one line cut through their restraint. The passengers for the 728 convoy are to be received and held until signal clearance. Ensure no deviation from containment protocol. The tone was not logistical. It was clinical, detached, as if the passengers were not evacuees but test subjects. Other letters mentioned signal phenomena and phase interference. There were sketches of wave patterns and strange energy signatures resembling the pulse frequencies of early radar technology, except inverted. One annotation in the margin read, "Convergence at threshold confirmed, biological response unpredictable." Harrow realized, with growing horror, that these documents hinted at an experiment, perhaps one conducted under the guise of wartime necessity, using the chaos of the Blitz as cover, a project that might have sought to harness or weaponize electromagnetic fields, unaware of what it would awaken, or perhaps fully aware and willing to proceed regardless. The next discovery came folded inside an envelope, sealed with wax so old it crumbled at her touch. Inside were photographs, grainy and blurred, showing the train as it had appeared before departure. The platform was dim, the evacuees lined up neatly, their faces indistinct, except for one detail that made her freeze. Standing beside the children was a group of adults in identical long coats, each wearing what appeared to be metallic badges shaped like the same looping symbol carved into the shelter walls. Their presence was not documented anywhere in official history. She turned one photograph over and found handwriting in the corner. Phase Watchers, Paddington, 18, Hook 1940. The ink had faded to brown, but the words still pulsed with intent, as though whoever wrote them wanted to be found. She drove back toward London with the documents sealed in her trunk, unaware that her movements were being monitored. Surveillance footage from traffic cameras later confirmed that an unmarked black vehicle followed her for over 40 miles before vanishing without trace near the Thames. When she reached her flat that night, she noticed that her front door, though locked, felt slightly warm to the touch, as if someone had stood there moments before her arrival. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed, but the sense of intrusion lingered. Her laptop no longer accepted her password. The lights flickered once, twice, and then returned to normal. She backed up the files on multiple drives, hiding each in separate locations, as if some instinct warned her that time was running out. It was during this period that a new pattern began to emerge. Reports surfaced online, quickly deleted but archived by persistent users, of spontaneous electrical failures in nearby villages, accompanied by low-frequency hums that vibrated through the ground. Farmers described the earth breathing at night, rising and falling beneath the frost. One man claimed to have seen a flicker of light beneath his fields, as if a hidden train were still moving somewhere under the soil. When Harrow mapped these occurrences, she noticed they followed a perfect alignment with the old Great Western Railway path, the very route Convoy 728 was supposed to have taken. It was as though the buried train had become active again, pulsing through the landscape like a heart remembering how to beat. Driven by equal parts fear and fascination, Harrow returned to the excavation site one last time. The perimeter was deserted, the military having abandoned it months before. Only the scar of the filled trench remained, covered in frost and weeds. She set up her instruments, a simple geophone array and an EMF detector, and waited through the night. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the ground began to tremble. The detector's needle swung violently to the far end of its range. Then faintly, from beneath her feet, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a whistle. Distant, distorted, but real. She pressed her ear to the frozen earth. Through the static hum of the soil, voices began to surface. Children's voices, faint and overlapping, repeating a single word she couldn't understand. It sounded like home. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Her recorder had captured only silence. She fled before dawn, leaving behind her instruments and any illusion of safety. 2 days later, she contacted an underground network of historians and digital archivists who specialized in classified disappearances. Together, they began piecing together the fragments. The convoy's missing paperwork, the strange sigil, the intercepted letters, the coordinates. What emerged was a theory both impossible and terrifying. That the train had not simply been buried by accident or human design, but phased, shifted out of conventional space-time through an experimental weapon or signal meant to manipulate radar fields. The containment, referenced in the letters, might have referred not to physical imprisonment, but to an attempt to hold something that had crossed from another side. The evacuees were not the victims of war. They were the subjects of a boundary test that succeeded too well. As the archivists worked, one of them, a former cryptographer, noticed that the looping sigil was not purely symbolic. It was a waveform, a diagram of resonance frequencies plotted into shape. When converted into sound and amplified, it produced a tone identical to the hum heard on the recovered recorder. They began calling it the threshold frequency. Those who listened to it for extended periods reported nausea, dizziness, and hallucinations of motion, as if their bodies were being pulled sideways through invisible currents. The team decided to destroy the file after one of their members collapsed during playback, describing faces in the static before losing consciousness, but Harrow kept a copy. She couldn't let it go. What she would soon discover is that the sound was not just a record of the past. It was a signal still transmitting, and someone, somewhere, was listening. If you've stayed with me through this descent into memory and soil, let the story's darkness draw you closer. Subscribe now so you don't lose the thread. Because what Harrow finds next won't just rewrite history. It will question reality itself. The recording that Dr. Evelyn Harrow preserved became her obsession. She listened to it night after night, headphones pressed against her ears, as if the low hum that pulsed through it could answer the questions the world refused to acknowledge. Each time, she swore she could hear something new, a faint word, a shift in the tone, a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of her own heart. She began to catalog the intervals of silence, marking them on paper like coordinates, as though she could chart meaning from the absences between sounds. Sleep eluded her. Food lost its taste. Her neighbors reported strange lights flickering through the curtains of her flat at impossible hours, accompanied by a faint metallic vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. One evening, when the power in her building briefly failed, several residents claimed to have seen through the stairwell window a faint outline of an old-fashioned train carriage passing through the fog, completely silent and without rails. The following week, Harrow vanished. Her apartment was found locked from the inside, her laptop open on the desk, its screen filled with lines of text, strings of numbers repeating over and over, forming what appeared to be a pattern. They were timestamps corresponding to historical railway signals, all from the night of October 18th, 1940. Her car remained parked outside. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of forced entry, and yet she was gone. The only clue was a small scrap of paper left on her kitchen counter, torn from one of her notebooks. On it, in hurried handwriting, She had written, "The frequency isn't from us." After her disappearance, the encrypted files she had distributed among the archivists began to unlock themselves one by one, as though triggered by a timed release she had prepared in advance. Inside were not only her research notes, but several recovered transmissions intercepted from a declassified radar experiment conducted during the Blitz. The audio fragments, though degraded, revealed a chilling progression. The first was static, ordinary interference. The second, hours later, contained faint distortions resembling human speech, and the third, transmitted minutes before, Convoy 728 vanished, captured a sound unmistakably like a train whistle, echoing through frequencies where no radio signal should have existed. A subsequent report from a military engineer at the time described it as a harmonic inversion event, in which radar waves folded back upon themselves, creating a resonance that destabilized surrounding magnetic fields. In simpler terms, the signal had formed a loop, trapping itself and everything within its reach inside an electromagnetic echo. Harrow's notes suggested that Convoy 728 had been rerouted to pass directly through this anomaly's coordinates, possibly as part of an intentional experiment. The evacuees, unwittingly, had become instruments in a military test to measure the impact of the resonance on biological matter, but the results were not measurable in any ordinary sense. They were catastrophic. The train had not exploded, burned, or derailed. It had simply phased out of conventional space, carried into a dimension of distortion that defied the linear flow of time. When it finally re-emerged, buried beneath the earth, it was no longer part of the same continuum. The carriages had aged, but their contents had not. Clocks stopped at the same instant, watches frozen mid-tick, food left uneaten, still intact. It was as if time itself had been subtracted from the train, leaving behind only residue and echoes. Yet there was another layer to the files, something more personal, hidden beneath the data. A series of voice notes recorded by Harrow in the final weeks before she vanished. In one, her voice trembles as she says, "They're not dead. The readings show vital traces, patterns of bioelectric activity, faint but consistent. It's like they're still in motion somewhere else, caught between intervals of time. The ground above the site isn't stable. It breathes because what's underneath is trying to return." In another she whispers, "I saw them, not in dreams, in reflection. The faces in the glass, they recognize me." Her last recording, time-stamped just hours before her disappearance, was only 3 words. The signal answered. After her vanishing, the archivists who had worked with her began receiving encrypted messages from her old contact accounts. At first, they dismissed them as spam, until one of them decoded the metadata and discovered the origin was impossible. It traced back to a location under the excavation site itself, using a signal frequency identical to the one emitted by the buried train. The messages contained fragments of Harrow's voice, distorted but unmistakable, speaking in loops, repeating certain phrases as if trapped in replay. "Don't dig, don't call the name." Over time, the voice degraded, merging with the static, until it became indistinguishable from the hum that had haunted her. By late 2025, the government quietly resumed control over the site. Satellite imagery showed new structures built over the fields, disguised as agricultural research facilities. Locals reported hearing machinery underground and seeing columns of mist rise at night, illuminated from below by pale light. One witness described what looked like a window opening in the air, a shimmer of translucent vibration that appeared and vanished before dawn. The official explanation cited gas emissions from soil disturbances, but no geological survey was ever released. Among the underground network of researchers, a darker theory emerged, that the signal had not been silenced, but contained, and that whatever had been pulled out of space-time in 1940 was still active beneath the Earth, transmitting its own message into the world above. What made the theory more disturbing was that similar anomalies began to appear elsewhere. In France, a forgotten World War II bunker was found humming with identical frequencies. In Germany, a section of abandoned rail track glowed faintly under ultraviolet light, with soil readings identical to those taken near the Berkshire site. Even across the Atlantic, in Maine, fishermen began reporting static interference on their radios during fog, accompanied by what sounded like distant trains beneath the ocean floor. Each event aligned with the same date on the calendar, October 18th. The same hour, the same resonance pattern. It was as though the vanished convoy had become an echo traveling through time, bleeding into every place that shared its coordinates across the globe. The deeper researchers looked, the more they realized that Harrow's disappearance had not been an isolated tragedy. A timeline emerged, linking vanishings, electrical storms, and unexplained power failures to points along the old rail network. Something was spreading, not in space, but in frequency. The line between the living and the lost had blurred, carried on wavelengths that refused to die. Those who listened too long to the recordings, those who studied the resonance, began reporting auditory hallucinations. A few described seeing flickers of motion in mirrors or reflections of windows. One researcher confessed before destroying his files that he had begun hearing the sound of a train approaching every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., no matter where he was. And then there were the dreams. Survivors from the excavation team began to share identical nightmares, visions of children staring from fog-shrouded platforms, their faces pale and eyes reflecting the faint glow of signal lights. Each dream ended the same way, with the whistle of a train that never arrived and the sensation of being watched from beneath the ground. Psychologists called it shared trauma. Others called it a warning. If you're still listening, if this darkness has wrapped itself around your curiosity, then hold that feeling close. The story is not over. The missing train was only the beginning of a signal that never stopped transmitting. Like this story itself, it keeps moving forward, quietly, relentlessly, beneath everything we think we understand. And if you want to follow its echo to the end, stay with us. Subscribe before the next pulse. The next part takes us where no one returned. By November of 2025, whispers of the Berkshire signal had begun to circulate in the corners of the internet, where rumor, conspiracy, and truth bled into one another. The ministry's denials, the sealed site, and the quiet disappearances only deepened the fascination. Threads emerged on obscure forums claiming to have intercepted the frequency that Dr. Evelyn Harrow had discovered. Most were hoaxes, distorted hums, manipulated audio, staged footage of fog rolling over abandoned rail lines. But one recording stood apart. It appeared suddenly on a private network used by amateur radio operators, uploaded under a username identical to Harrow's research handle, though she had been missing for months. The file's title was chilling in its simplicity: Phase Return. The sound began faintly, almost imperceptible, like a distant vibration beneath the floorboards. Then came the pattern, a low, undulating hum repeating in intervals of 7 seconds, interrupted by what listeners described as the soft echo of metal wheels on tracks. At the 3-minute mark, a voice could be heard beneath the static, faint and layered, speaking as if from a tunnel. "Home. Can't. Light ahead." The voice cut, distorted, then returned. "They didn't close it. The door is still open." The final seconds of the recording were consumed by a roar of interference so intense that it damaged several listeners' speakers. In the wake of the upload, dozens of users claimed to experience vertigo, migraines, or what one described as the sensation of falling sideways through air. Within hours, the file was removed from every platform. Its origin, though traced, led nowhere. An IP address located directly within the coordinates of the sealed Berkshire site. Around this time, a small group of independent researchers decided to investigate the location themselves. Led by a retired physicist named Dr. Marcus Lyle, they called their effort Operation Threshold, borrowing Harrow's own terminology. Lyle had once worked on classified communication systems for the Royal Air Force, and his interest in the phenomenon was both scientific and personal. His grandfather had been one of the railway engineers assigned to the original evacuation in 1940, one of the last to see Convoy 728 before it vanished. In one of his letters, written decades later, he had confessed to witnessing a shimmer in the air that folded the world like glass. Lyle's team believed that the answer to what had happened to the train lay not in the physical wreckage, but in the frequency itself, a standing wave still resonating between moments of time. They arrived at the outskirts of Berkshire under the pretense of geological surveying. Their instruments included portable EMF arrays, ground-penetrating radar, and something more experimental, a resonance modulator capable of replicating the waveform of Harrow's threshold frequency. Their plan was simple: reproduce the conditions of 1940, locate the point of maximum harmonic interference, and observe what occurred. On the night of November 18th, under a fog so dense it swallowed the stars, they set up the array near the old barn's remains. As the device began to hum, the ground beneath them trembled, not violently but rhythmically, like the pulse of something vast sleeping beneath the soil. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time marked in Harrow's recordings, the detectors began to spike. The hum deepened, turning into a vibration that resonated in the chest rather than the ears. The air grew colder. Then, without warning, the mist ahead of them began to move against the wind, coiling into a shape that stretched across the field, a corridor of distortion that shimmered like glass. Through it, faint lights flickered, the dull glow of oil lamps, reflections on steel, silhouettes of figures standing in stillness. The team watched, frozen, as a train emerged from the fog. Its carriages half-transparent, their edges bleeding into the night, as though the world itself could not decide whether to let them exist. Lyle's assistant, recording on a handheld camera, captured every second before the feed cut to static. The footage would later surface briefly online before being removed, but eyewitness accounts remained consistent. The apparition of the train halted directly over the buried site, its wheels hovering inches above the earth. From within, shadows moved, figures pressing against the windows, their faces pale and blurred. Children, women, men, all dressed in 1940s attire, their mouths open in silent screams that produced no sound. The mist grew thicker until the shapes were barely visible. Then the whistle came, a single, mournful note that vibrated through the ground like thunder. The glass of the instruments shattered. The lights went out. And when they returned, the train was gone. Of the 6 members of Operation Threshold, only 3 made it back to the vehicle. 2 were found hours later, wandering through nearby fields, disoriented, their clothes damp with condensation though the air was dry. They spoke of being inside the train, of corridors that stretched endlessly, and of a voice whispering through the intercom, counting down numbers that never reached 0. The 6th member, Dr. Lyle, was never found. In his last radio transmission, recorded moments before the power surge, he was heard saying, "They're not gone. They're waiting for the signal to complete the loop." Authorities arrived within the hour, sealing off the area once again. Every trace of the team's equipment was confiscated, yet rumors persisted that one of the recovered cameras contained footage that couldn't be explained. Frames showing the train interior lit from within, but with the windows reflecting the faces of people standing outside, not those trapped inside. A paradox caught on film. As weeks passed, reports began surfacing from far beyond England. Across Europe, railway sensors detected phantom signals on abandoned lines, all transmitting the same harmonic frequency as Berkshire's anomaly. In Poland, an old freight tunnel collapsed after a tremor that registered no seismic activity. Witnesses nearby claimed to hear the sound of a train passing underground, though the line had been sealed since 1945. In Italy, fishermen recorded sonar echoes beneath Lake Garda that resembled the pattern of rolling wheels. The phenomenon was spreading, threading itself through the bones of forgotten war routes, as though following a buried network beneath the continents. One night, a radio operator stationed near Dover intercepted a live broadcast on a dead frequency, an Englishwoman's voice reciting numbers in a calm, measured tone. Analysts later confirmed that the cadence matched the rhythm of Harrow's old recordings. Between the numbers, faintly, came the sound of children laughing and the echo of a distant whistle. The broadcast ended abruptly, replaced by a single line of distorted speech that chilled every listener who heard it. We never reached home. By December, what had begun as an archaeological discovery had become something closer to a haunting of the world itself. The boundaries between history and the present were dissolving. Every attempt to contain the frequency failed. The hum continued to manifest in radiostatic, electrical lines, even in human tinnitus. It was as if the vanished evacuees had become a wavelength, eternally circling the planet in search of a destination that no longer existed. Those who had worked on the excavation described the same dream before resigning. A train slowing to a stop on a platform that stretched into darkness, the doors opening onto an empty landscape of ash and mist. A voice, soft and familiar, whispering, "All aboard." And then always the feeling of being pulled forward, not by fear, but by inevitability. If you felt that pull, the hum in your chest as the story deepens, let it guide you closer. Like the signal, this story doesn't end. It only loops. Stay with us. Subscribe so you can follow the final return when the train makes its last journey back through the veil. In the winter of 2025, the world seemed to hum, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally, low, steady vibrations lingering at the edge of hearing, beneath the static of radios, beneath the quiet between breaths. The hum had no single source. It resonated in phone lines, in old speakers, in the metal bones of buildings. Across cities, people began to report sleepless nights filled with dreams of fog, of platforms lined with empty suitcases, of trains gliding silently through endless tunnels without rails. Psychologists called it collective resonance syndrome, But those who had followed the story of Convoy 728 knew better. The Berkshire signal had spread. What had once been buried beneath a barn was now awake in the circuitry of the modern world. The ministry denied everything, of course. They called it hysteria, misinformation, mass suggestion amplified by social media. But leaked documents from within the Defense Communications Division told a darker story. Engineers had traced the resonance pattern to the understructure of London itself, where forgotten rail tunnels intersected like arteries beneath the city. The hum was strongest near Paddington Station, the very place from which the vanished train had departed 85 years earlier. Sensors detected pulses repeating every 7 minutes, identical to those recorded at the Berkshire site. Yet no machinery, no trains, no electrical systems accounted for them. It was as if something beneath the city was breathing in perfect rhythm with the world above. Late in December, power outages swept across the capital. Whole districts plunged into darkness without warning. When the lights returned, commuters described seeing flashes of motion through the underground tunnels, reflections of people who weren't there, shapes moving parallel to the platforms, their outlines flickering like light distorted by water. Several witnesses claimed they heard music faintly echoing from nowhere, a child's lullaby carried on the air between stations. Others swore that when they peered into the blackness of the tunnels, they saw the faint glow of lanterns moving far below the tracks, receding slowly into the depths. It was during one of these outages that an anonymous transmission reached a pirate radio operator near Bristol. The voice that spoke through the static was unmistakably that of Dr. Evelyn Harrow. "They're almost through," she said, her tone urgent, yet calm. "The signal completes the loop tonight. We were never meant to find them. They were meant to find us. The train is not under the barn anymore. It's beneath the city, beneath every city. We brought it with us." Then the signal cut to silence. The operator tried to trace its origin, but the transmission came from multiple sources simultaneously, as if her voice had been embedded across the global network, transmitted through every frequency at once. By midnight, emergency services began receiving dozens of reports of tremors across southern England. The epicenter was impossible to define. Satellite readings showed a fluctuating energy field spreading in concentric circles, matching the harmonic frequency first identified by Harrow. For a brief window of 8 minutes, every digital clock in the country froze at 3:17 a.m. During that time, aircraft instruments malfunctioned, GPS systems failed, and radio communication was replaced by a single continuous tone, the sound of a distant whistle echoing through static. Those awake described feeling a sudden weight in the air, a pressure in the chest, as if gravity itself had changed. And then, just as abruptly, the world resumed. In the aftermath, Londoners discovered something impossible. At several disused underground stations, entire sections of tunnel had appeared overnight. Structures built in the architectural style of the 1940s, complete with signage and rusted rail tracks that led nowhere. Surveillance footage from the night of the blackout captured faint shapes emerging from these tunnels, silhouettes of passengers stepping onto invisible platforms, fading as soon as they crossed the threshold into open air. Among them were children carrying small suitcases, women clutching coats against a wind that wasn't there, men in wartime uniforms glancing around as if disoriented by the modern world. Some images showed their shadows remaining behind even after their bodies vanished, etched briefly into the walls like burns. Officials cordoned off the areas within hours. The entrances were sealed, the footage confiscated, but rumors spread faster than containment. People began leaving flowers and old train tickets near Paddington, whispering the names of lost relatives from the evacuation lists. For many, it became less a haunting than a homecoming, the sense that history was folding back on itself to return what had been taken. Yet others felt dread, claiming that every night since, the city's air grew heavier, the lights dimmer, the world slightly out of sync. Some swore that when they stood alone in quiet rooms, they could hear the faint chime of a conductor's bell and the echoing phrase, "Tickets, please." Beyond Britain, the phenomenon reached the global network. Devices began to fail in synchrony, producing the same 7-minute pulse that echoed from the Berkshire site. Researchers detected it in fiber optic cables, in undersea communication lines, even in the rhythmic flicker of satellites orbiting above. The hum had become omnipresent, threading itself into the infrastructure of modern civilization. Those attuned to it began describing strange experiences, visions of landscapes out of time, of warplanes frozen mid-air, of trains traveling through fields of ash beneath a sky with no sun. One astrophysicist suggested that the resonance had created a standing wave between dimensions, a temporal echo through which fragments of lost moments could leak into the present. But for others, it wasn't theory. It was revelation. Among the leaked documents that surfaced weeks later, one in particular stood out, a single-page memorandum dated January 1st, 2026. Its header bore the insignia of the Ministry of Defense, though no department name was listed. It read, "The phase window is now global. Convoy 728 no longer exists as a historical event, but as an active waveform embedded in terrestrial resonance. Attempts to neutralize the signal have failed. Recommendation: do not interfere further. Observation only." Below the text, a final handwritten line appeared, unsigned. They were never lost. We were. In the months that followed, sightings multiplied. In the fog of early morning, commuters waiting for their trains swore they saw another platform reflected in the glass. An older world, sepia-toned and distant, where the lost passengers stood waiting, forever mid-journey. Sometimes, just before the modern train arrived, the faint whistle of another could be heard beneath it, layered in impossible harmony. People began to listen for it deliberately, holding their breath when the sound came, unsure whether to feel terror or reverence. And then one night, surveillance footage from Paddington captured what no one could explain. At 3:17 a.m., with the station empty, the cameras recorded the sudden illumination of a long-abandoned platform, Platform 13B, decommissioned since 1954. The lamps flickered to life, the air thickened with mist, and from that mist a train emerged. Its paint was peeled, its windows cracked, its number plate glinting faintly beneath decades of grime. 728. The doors opened. Inside, there was only stillness. No passengers, only the faint sound of wind and the distant voice of a woman whispering through the intercom. All clear. Everyone home. The feed ended there, the timestamp freezing once more at 3:17. Since then, the hum has never truly stopped. It lingers in the quiet between thunder and silence, in the static of forgotten frequencies, in the tremor of the rails beneath the city. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in the depths of night, you might hear it too. The faint whistle of a train that should not exist, calling softly from a place just beneath the skin of the world. A reminder that history is not buried. It is merely waiting for the signal to return. If the chill of this story has followed you into the silence, then let it stay. Like the hum beneath our cities, let it echo. Remember to like this video, subscribe, and tell me what you felt when you heard the whistle. Because somewhere, beneath the fog, the past is still moving, and it's listening